think if we would have had a couple more verses, we could have caught up with one another. What do you think? We were getting better with each verse. Gosh, it's good to be here, and it's good to see everyone. Some old friends, some new friends, and this is the church that I took my lessons in. I got my ordination through and all my certifications. So it's a lot, has a feeling to me of coming home. And that's, I know a lot of us have felt that way coming through these doors. Today I want to talk to you about the roots of spiritualism. Now, when we talk about the roots of spiritualism, most of the time we think about when spiritualism celebrates its birthday, which is March 31st of 1848. And that is when Spirit chose the time to step forward and make themselves known. For whatever reason, we don't know that was the very specific time that they chose. But the roots of spiritualism go back much further. When we define spiritualism, our simple definition of spiritualism is the science, philosophy, and religion of continuous life. I did some digging because I wanted to know from whence we had made that decision to adopt that vernacular, the science, the philosophy, and religion. When did science actually start? When did philosophy have its beginning? What about when religion had its beginning? When were these three things formed? Let's go back to 470 BC. I remember it well. I have every gray hair to prove it. There were three great Greek philosophers, and today I'm actually going to talk to you about four, but the three great Greek philosophers were Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And I'm also going to speak to you about Hippocrates as well. Now, Socrates was born around 470 BC, and he was a Mason, but he soon found that that wasn't his primary interest. In fact, he had little or no interest in the mundane things of the world, so to speak, and he was more interested in the finer aspects of living. So, he started wandering the streets and asking questions of the youth. What is the best state? What is the meaning of virtue? And soon he got a big following. Now that didn't make the political leaders of the day very happy, because they felt that he was corrupting the youth. So they put him on trial, and they gave him an option. They found him guilty because he was an embarrassment to them. And the political people didn't want him pulling the youth away from their standardized teachings. So when they found him guilty, they gave him an option of whether he wanted to be put into exile or put to death. And he wasn't afraid of death, and he chose death. And his beloved student, who was 30 years old at the time, a guy by the name of Plato, stood with him right to the bitter end when he drank a concoction including hemlock, which is a poison, and he passed away. Now, Plato carried on his work. We have very little in the way of what Socrates wrote, because he didn't record anything. So most of what we know from Socrates was brought to us through Plato. Now, Plato was 30 years old when Socrates passed away, and as he carried on his teachings, you remember the telephone game when you were a kid and you started at one end of the line, and by the time you got to the other, the story was totally changed? Well, that's what happened. You see, Plato started out teaching Socrates' ideas, but then, as time went on, he developed his own way of going, so to speak, and his own philosophy, and opened a school called the Academy, and he taught mathematics and basic subjects of the day. But his primary interest was in illusion versus reality. And he believed that this life was an illusion, and that the reality was actually realized when we passed on, because he believed in the continuity of life. In fact, that was his favorite subject. And he explained it like this: if we all lived in a cave, and all we could see from the front of the cave was shadows on the wall, then we would believe that the outside world was indeed black and white, gray and white, and was a shadow world. Now, if one of us ventured outside and we actually saw what was out here, the green of the trees and the three-dimensional formation of all of the things that exist in our world, and then turned around and went back in and tried to explain it to everybody, they would think we were mad. Right? Just like the earth was once believed to be flat. So, Plato his illusion versus reality concept and the continuity of life began to take a stronghold, and to this day, some 2,400 years later, we have evidence. It took a stronghold in Christianity, and it took a stronghold in Judaism. The religions of that day adopted some of his teachings, and the concept of life after death took a hold. And to this day, again, some 2,400 years later, we still see evidence of his teachings. I'll call your attention to the fourth principle, that we retain our personal identity after the change called death. Around the year of 384 BC, another great Greek philosopher named Aristotle came on board. Now, Aristotle was born to a wealthy class, if you will, because his father, his name was Nicomachus. Nicomachus was a doctor for the elite back then. So a lot of Aristotle's upbringing was influenced by his father. And he became a student of Plato's and studied with Plato about 20 years. But at the end of the day, he felt that his philosophy and Plato's philosophies were too far apart. So he went out and he opened his own school, and he named that school after a god, the god Apollo Lycius, and he named the school the Lyceum. Interesting, isn't it? And in his teachings, what he found was that He was more or less a guy that we would call a biologist, if you will. He believed that God is found in nature, and that God is influenced by all of nature. Now, what's interesting is the word God back then meant mankind. That was the definition of God back then. So what he did was he began to record and observe, like a biologist would, record information and put it down and organize it, and base his philosophy on observed facts. And he became known as the father of science. Now, our definition of why we call spiritualism a philosophy is because it studies the laws of nature, both on the seen and unseen sides of life, and bases its conclusions upon present observed facts. It accepts statements of observed facts of past ages and conclusions drawn therefrom, when sustained by reason and by results of observed facts of the present day. That is our definition of why spiritualism was a philosophy. And the first person that recorded this information that we know of was Aristotle. And he was a prolific writer. He wrote over 200 pieces of works, but they were very hard to discern because they were like cliff notes on the sides of pages and so on and so forth. What's also interesting about Aristotle was that he called theoretical science his first philosophy. Theoretical science is what we call metaphysics today. Hippocrates was known to Plato. He was also known to Aristotle. They were in different parts of Greece. And he was born about 460 BC. And I say about because record keeping back then was maybe not so much, a little bit sketchy. The reason that we know that these men knew him is because Plato mentions Hippocrates twice in his writings. And they recognize him in those writings as the great physician. Later, we know Hippocrates became known as the father of medicine. And to this day, the loosely defined version of the Hippocratic Oath, which is what doctors take when they become doctors, goes like this. I swear to fulfill, to the best of my ability and judgment, this covenant. I will respect the hard-won scientific gains of those physicians in whose steps I walk, and gladly share such knowledge as is mine with those who are to follow. Don't doctors consult one another when there's an issue on the table? That goes back to Hippocrates, folks. So we have Aristotle, the father of science. We have Hippocrates, the father of medicine. And although never named, I believe Plato could have very well been called the father of religion. Aristotle, what he did was he documented, and documented some more in observed facts in nature that they were able to be classified as facts. Now, what classifies something as a fact is called the repeatability factor. That in any given circumstance, that an issue or can be recreated, if you will, over and over and over again, given the same combination of elements, right? If A and B are put together, you get C. Every time, all the time. So, spiritualism, the science, philosophy, and religion of continuous life, brought to us by great men. Now, this doesn't mean that spiritualism wasn't in existence prior to that. It was not known by the word spiritualism, just like back then it wasn't known by the word spiritualism. Our ability to communicate with those in the spirit world has been in existence since the beginning of recorded history, and we assume since the beginning of time. So when we look to our roots, and we think in terms of March 31st, 1848, know that there's a whole history of spiritualism prior to that. The whole reason why we're able to define spiritualism as a science, a philosophy, and religion. Because back then, taking a look at one snapshot in time, I believe that Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and Hippocrates gave us the foundation and were forerunners of our religion. We breathe the same air that they breathed. When we gaze upon the sky, we're looking at the same stars they saw. March 31st, 1848 is the day that modern American spiritualism found its way to the forefront. But spiritualism's roots go back so much further. God bless you.